other multilateral organizations. We have Bill Maloney, Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank, Ernesto Shadrowski, Director of Socioeconomic Research at CAF, and also author of one of the background papers of our report, and Eric Parrado, Chief Economist and General Manager at the Research Department of the IDB. I will not take any more time. Luis Felipe, you can share screen, and we're ready for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Marcela. Very briefly, also thank you to Juan Fernando Vargas and certainly to La CEA for allowing us to be partners as UNDP and for allowing us to have this space. And thank you so much for joining to Bill, Ernesto, and Eric. It's really great to have you here to discuss our reports. And in that sense, that's why when we were discussing what to do, it was a good idea, we thought, to have a short presentation and rather hear from you. Because of course, in a way, this is the idea is not only to see the report as an end point, but actually as the starting point of a conversation that has to continue, and getting your views on the work and the way forward would be super helpful for us. So thank you for that. Thank you, Ernesto, that was also a contributor with the background paper to the report. And I have to say, of course, I am, if there is something called free riding, this is a very clear example because I'm presenting work done by Marcela and her team, and I am the one taking the stage to present. But I hope I will do a reasonably good job at presenting the super rich content in the report. Marcela has always a very thorough presentation. I wanted to do something short and looking into some of the things that we believe are new in the report. As you know, there are always in these types of reports three different inputs. One is some original research that we wanted to also contribute to advancement of research, and in that sense also our working papers, the background papers, is very important to have the highest quality, and we have more than 23,000 downloads, which we're very happy for. So that's because, of course, Marcela brought together a very good team and a very good group of researchers behind it. So that's the new research. The second is taking stock of what we have learned in the last two decades or so about this issue. But the third is also taking some risks and trying to advance the narrative in a way, in ways that can open new questions. No? So first point is what we mean by the trap. So basically, there are two structural aspects of the region that we wanted to interconnect. So one is very mediocre growth, as you can see on the left, compared to other regions. Latin America has a very mediocre growth performance, something we know very well, but it's also very volatile, not only mediocre, but also, this is not, of course, unrelated, very volatile. Sometimes we present a graph with the number of years with negative growth. That was, the first time I saw that graph was Emily Sinnott in the SCD for Argentina at the bank. And then from then, I always update this graph, and we can see the number of years with negative growth for Latin American countries, and Argentina has the largest number of years with negative growth, and actually is the second largest in the world. Only after Democratic Republic of Congo, but also, so we have the most resilient economy, Colombia, the least resilient, Argentina, but we see that on average, our region is very volatile in terms of the growth pattern. We look into what determines that, and we see that if we look at factor accumulation versus productivity, certainly we do poorly as a region in terms of productivity. So at the end, what we want to bring as the root cause of growth, I always cite, Krugman, that says the long-term productivity is not everything, but it's almost everything. So there is a very serious concern about structurally low productivity and stagnant productivity. But also we have this high inequality. As you know, we had this reduction in income inequality as measured in household surveys since the beginning of this century, but then it stagnated again at a relatively high level, mainly explained this reduction by a compression of the wage gap, so a reduction in the skills premium, and a better targeting of some elements of spending, mainly due to conditional cash transfers and so on. So these two elements, 2/3 more or less, is the wage compression. So it's through the labor market. 1/3 is through the better redistribution, in a sense, or better, I would say, incidence of certain elements of spending. And that explains a certain reduction of inequality, but stays very high compared to other regions. As you know, I wrote a paper with Santiago Levy on this reduction of the wage premium, looking at whether actually it's something that might be related more on the demand side, and in that sense also linked to the problem of productivity. In spite of this, we continue to be a region with very high level of inequality. So these two aspects that are structurally there in our region, our report tries to precisely bring a new look into the links, right? So what is we believe, or some of the elements that we believe are new in the report. So one is precisely the links between those two aspects, but also how that determines the perceptions about inequality. So we conducted with Latino Barometer a survey or some questions within the survey to look into the perceptions. That's chapter 2. We look at the analysis of one manifestation of power asymmetries, looking into market power specifically. The other is the links between, of course, the roots of productivity dynamics as explaining the mediocre growth, and the integrated analysis of complex factors perpetuating the trap related to violence, related to the political responses, political incentives that drive policy responses that could actually exacerbate the trap, and how we can potentially think of elements to break this trap. So these are the aspects that we believe are in a way new. So the high inequality, low growth, productivity that constitute this trap, that determines also perceptions of inequality, and are as underlying factors. There is this concentration of power, the fact that conflict becomes a trigger of violence. Also, that the exit to the social contract has to do with illegal activities and violence, but also how again, as I said before, the political incentives are so that policies are not necessarily offsetting these patterns. All of these, we see it as a systemic issue, and in that sense, an issue related to effective governance. So key messages in our report. One is this disconnect between perceptions of inequality and objective indicators of inequality. So this is only one graph on the left, but you can see in chapter 2, there is a very thorough discussion on these results of how this, the disconnect between how people perceive themselves in the income distribution, what is the actual position of people in the income distribution, and how they would like the income distribution to be. And in a way, the fact that the respondents who think that the system is unfair and how they misperceive their own place in the income distribution is really large. So look at different aspects of access to education, health, justice, and income per se. And we have these perceptions that also lead to this final sort of summary indicator that tells us that people think that the system is basically working in the favor of very specific groups. So there is this perception of capture, if we can call it that way. So one of the elements that determine this is the issue of power asymmetries in general, and one manifestation of those power asymmetries is market power. that, of course, affects both inequality and low growth or low productivity. The size distribution of firms that you know very well have been thoroughly discussed by many in the literature. We look at that, and I think the work done by the two Marcelas, Marcela Melendez and Marcela Eslava, that constitute the basis of this chapter, chapter 3, I think is very good and very comprehensive, because we have a cross-country evidence on this issue of the interaction between firm size, market concentration, and inequality. I think the estimates of these markups is very interesting, because you see how Europe or the OECD in general, are very concerned about the increase in market power and the increase in markups. And we see that Latin America has had these very high markups for at least 3 decades, which is what we look at the evidence that we have in the report. So these very persistent high market power, high markups, that of course affects the productivity and affects inequality, of course, and then the very low capacity of the state to redistribute. So this is a summary graph of work done by Nora Lustig and co-authors and others, that looks at the pre and post tax and spending income distribution. And we see that in general in Latin America, the Gini changes very little compared to what happens in other regions. So this leads to the fact that we know that from our Hirschmanian perspective that development is conflict, but conflict not always is processed by violent means. But in our region, we have a region that has 9% of the population of the world and 35% of the homicides in the world. So it's a very violent region. Ernesto has a very nice piece on this, looking at the interaction between inequality and violence in a very systematic, empirical way. So we find that indeed inequality has an effect per se, as inequality controlling for other aspects on violence, but also how violence feeds back into inequality, because it affects human capital accumulation, income generation, deprivation in terms of rights and freedoms, but also affects productivity, because it leads to distorted investment patterns, lower security of property rights, and destroys physical and natural capital. So this trap is again reinforced by this persistent violence. Finally, the idea of the segmented, not fragmented, but segmented labor markets that are a key source of inequality, and related, of course, to some of the patterns we saw before about firm size, the fact that very, very high informality in our region, which is something we know very well, and Bill has worked a lot on this issue. But the idea that 59% of the workers in Latin America and the Caribbean are either self-employed or working in firms with less than 5 employees, and only about 80% work in firms with more than 100 employees. So this distorted size distribution of firms or skewed size distribution of firms explains part of the across firm productivity. We can, in a very simplified way, we can say that within firm productivity challenges, more explained by the Schumpeterian exposure to trade, this type of discussion, which is of course a very important issue in the region, by a sort of failed or incomplete connection to the world markets by in our region, but also the across firms allocation of resources, the misallocation across firms, which has to do with very small, very low productivity firms dominating the market versus firms that could actually increase the demand for higher skills and change completely the nature of the dynamics. One element here is that policies sometimes distort the issue, because one has to look at whether people are poor or non-poor in terms of targeting and social assistance. But when we talk about social protection or social insurance, we should look at whether people are formal or informal. What we see in the policy responses is that actually these two things are sort of mixed, and sometimes anti-poverty programs actually put as condition that you don't have a formal job, or this stuff. You start mixing these two things and creating a very distorted policy response that leads to reinforcement of the patterns that we saw before. So again, very, very simplified version of issues that individually have been analyzed. We try to bring them together as a dynamic, as a system that is more complex in those interactions. And in that sense, how the policy responses have to look at the systemic elements. But of course, we cannot, as many other colleagues in some places come up with, which is a very long list of things that we should do. And of course, we know that there are many things that we could do. But part of our effort was to try to find one thing. You had to make one thing that could change the dynamics, both in terms of productivity and inequality, as an exit proposal. Of course, not because the only one, but because it's a node in the system that could change the dynamics. And we think that the social protection element, rethinking social protection, and that is chapter 5, is the element to break that. By looking at this fragmented and ineffective system and try to understand better the interactions between fiscal system, social protection, productivity, and inequality, and try to bring this idea of new way of thinking about social protection that is universal, inclusive, in the sense that you use targeting as an instrument for universality. So you use targeting as a proactive instrument to try to bring everybody into the social protection system, but also that has to be growth friendly. That's the productivity element to the proposal. And of course, that is fiscally sustainable. So that is the entry point that we see as a way to break the dynamics. We have, of course, a very long, detailed discussion on why we believe that is the case. And of course, the background work for this is mainly the work by Santiago Levy. And now we're trying to have these conversations with policymakers in the region to try to convince them that this could be a good way to go about thinking of how to break this trap. So I hope I didn't go too far beyond my assigned time, but it's now the opportunity to hear from you. And of course, Marcela and some members of the team are here to also respond to these questions. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Luis Felipe, for even improving on the report with your presentation. We're going to move straight to the first round of questions, and the first question will go to Bill Maloney. Bill, our report argues that there are factors that are making us both highly unequal and characterized by our poor growth. We are saying that if we address those factors, those common factors properly, we could probably move the region forward in a positive direction on both fronts. This, to some extent, goes against what we have spoken all of our lives as economists about the trade-offs between efficiency and equity. You have studied for a long time productivity and innovation. I want to hear you on what is your reaction to this idea that we could do things that would be both productivity improving and inequality reducing, and if we could think about productivity increasing policies as inequality reducing policies. You have 6 minutes. Let's try to have 6-minute interventions in this round. You're muted still.
Okay, can you hear me now? Seems the World Bank internet is acting up. So I first wanted to thank the organizers, Marcela and Luis Felipe, for the invitation. I found this report really refreshing and putting a lot of important issues on the table. That's why we invited Marcela to present it at the bank, and it got a very good reception. In regards to your particular question, I just want to focus on 3 things quickly. The first is, I think there's strong complementarities both between the equity agenda and the productivity agenda in the following ways. Just beginning with workers for a second. LAC employers, roughly 30% of employers in Latin America report that they've got an inadequately educated workforce, and that is keeping them back from growth. That's relative to 20% for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world includes a lot of countries that are a lot poorer than Latin America. So right there, the fact that we've got primary schools throughout the region that are still generating PISA scores, which put us fairly low in the distribution, immediately suggests that focusing on that education issue is going to be important from the point of view of having our firms grow. But it's not only at the primary school level, it's also at the tertiary school level. Maria Marta Ferreira in my office just put out a report on what in the United States we would call community colleges. Everybody in Latin America wants to go to the university. But the fact of the matter is, in the United States and most of Europe, a bunch of kids instead, a much larger, go to community colleges, and they become técnicos y tecnológicos, which again are precisely the kinds of skills that many firms in Latin America are missing. And the attendees of those schools tend to be more from the lower classes. Yet if you look at subsidies across the region, the subsidies to university education or baccalaureate education are much higher than they are for these kinds of programs. So shifting of funding from there to from universities to these kind of community colleges would be both productivity increasing and also equity increasing. Just want to flag that Larry Katz and Claudia Golden wrote a book about 15 years ago talking about exactly this race between increasing technological sophistication of the economy and the production of skills. And they say the United States got where it is because it invested really heavily in education broadly and very early. And distribution follows precisely that, whether the demand for those skills is higher or lower than the supply of skills at that moment. But they explicitly make the link between the increase in productivity, enhancing education, and distribution. I want to say quickly something about entrepreneurship. In the book, The Innovation Paradox, which we put out several years ago, we asked, why is it that poor countries, and that includes Latin America, don't adopt new technologies? Well, the one thing we have to realize is technological arbitrage doesn't happen abstractly. It takes individuals, and it takes a lot of individuals. And in recent literature with Andres Zambrano, we argued that, in fact, part of the reason that LAC missed out in the second industrial revolution was precisely because it had a lack of qualified entrepreneurs, both in terms of quality, but also in terms of number. And you find that immigrants dominated industrialization throughout the region. So that immediately tells us that we're missing domestically generated entrepreneurs. What we're missing is a hungry emergent bourgeoisie. And again, that's not going to happen if you have an incredibly skewed income where you have a bunch of people who are effectively put out of the running for being entrepreneurs by low education and low access to any finance. Just touch on market power. We all know that if and I think there's a very provocative paper we'll come back to that Marcela and Marcela wrote. But if you have an incredibly concentrated industrial structure where you can prevent entry and where rents make it so you really don't have to try too hard on the innovation front, then you're going to get less entry. You're going to get less within firm improvements in productivity. And so again, and to the degree that maps to individual incomes, you're again going to get that more concentrated income is going to be, at least in that case, associated with lower productivity growth. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Bill. We'll move on to Eric. Eric, the IDB is going to soon be launching a report on trust, social cohesion, and growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. Could trust be another of those common factors between the high inequality, low growth trap that we argue exists in the region? Do you see a connection in the narratives we as organizations are proposing for the region, and why or why not?
Perfect. First of all, thank you, Marcela, Luis Felipe, and the rest of the UNDP team for the invitation to be part of this important session, and with my fellow panelists. It's fantastic to be here. And thank you for this question, Marcela, because there is no doubt that trust must be considered as another common and key factor behind low growth and high inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean. Trust and citizenship significantly impact all the key drivers of growth and equality, Economic growth depends on public policies and institutions, so mistrust and weak bonds of citizenships distort this relation. And the most important decisions that drive economic growth, to invest, employ, produce, buy or sell, all depend on trust. The most productive, skilled, and innovative individuals have greater economic opportunities in high trust societies. In societies without trust, these opportunities are very limited. So, for example, lack of trust impacts the competitiveness of the private sector. Companies are more likely to demand payment upfront. Managers and owners are less willing to delegate authority to others, and they often prefer to hire based on family or personal ties, sacrificing talent and innovation and consequently growth. So high trust makes it more likely that firms will treat workers more generously in the event of a crisis. Trust levels are correlated with innovation, given that more trust leads to more investment in research and development. Trust levels are also correlated with the depth of credit markets, with low barriers to entry and so on. In other words, trust is correlated with productivity and growth. Trust also affects the public policy that individuals demand. Public policies establish whether it's easy or hard to enter the market with a new company, for instance. Where it's hard, there might be less competition as a result and fewer incentives to innovate. On the other hand, public policy defines how efficient our education systems are and whether essential public infrastructure gets built. So when public policy fails, growth slows down and inequality rises. So growth-oriented policies that invest in long-term public goods may not be politically attractive because the cycles are very short. And particularly when voters don't trust governments to deliver on their promises. So countries where mistrust is high tend to spend a lot on private goods and transfers. Only in countries where trust is high, investment thrives in some way. So this mistrust and weak bonds of citizenship make hard to engage in collective action. Although all citizens are better off when we have policies in place that promote growth, individually, each of us has an incentive to be exempted from them. People would like to enjoy the benefits of infrastructure, tax, and regulatory compliance and education without paying their share on the cost of these policies. So individual firms prefer tax policies that favor them over the firms, but on average, firm growth and productivity are higher if tax policies apply equally to similar firms. Societies with high levels of trust and stronger bonds of citizenship are better able to overcome this collective action problem. In countries with higher levels of interpersonal trust, the rule of law and contract performance are stronger, along with the security of property rights and the quality of the legal system. So Latin American and the Caribbean countries are on average weaker on all of these aspects: trust, the rule of law, contract enforcement, the strength of property rights, and the quality of their legal system. So in the end, the narratives of our organizations, I think, are very similar. The region is in a low growth, high inequality trap, as you mentioned, and current public policy is not changing this. And we have to break this inertia in some way or another. So we have highly inefficient public spending and very distortionary tax systems that don't reduce inequality. Finally, a last point. Regarding our research agenda, we're about to release our 2021 flagship report about trust, citizenship, and growth. So we'll try to explain these very policies that I mentioned. So thank you very much, Marcela.
Thank you, Eric. Juan Camilo Cárdenas compared this morning trust to temperature on a thermometer, like a symptom of what is going on underneath. And probably this is why so many of the policy routes that you come to think about when you think about trust are so much connected to the things that we are suggesting when we talk about concentration of power and when we look at perceptions, for instance. That was a connection that I made this morning while listening at the conversation.
That's a very good analogy. We're going to use it then.
Ernesto, our report says that more unequal societies tend to be more violent. You provided new evidence exactly like to strengthen that argument. But it also says that more violent societies are also become also more unequal and grow less. There is this circular relationship that I'd like you to comment on between violence and inequality. Policy-wise, where do we begin? Illuminate us.
Thank you very much, Marcela and Luis Felipe, for the invitation, and also for the invitation of participating in your with the background paper to your report, and also thanks to my fellow panelists and to the Juan Vargas and the organizers of the conference. I really like in the report that the effort right from the title in identifying traps, these vicious circles in Latin America and the Caribbean. There is a big trap of high inequality and low growth in the region, and then this expresses it in specific traps. And one of them regards crime and violence. Something I like in particular in the report is how this topic is integrated into the whole analysis, because I belong to a bunch of Latin American economists working on crime, and sometimes we feel a little bit isolated from the general discussion, and this is really a main feature of Latin America. Not only we are a high inequality region, but we are a high crime, an outlier in terms of violence relative to our level of development, GDP per capita, or inequality including. The report highlights, as you introduced, and as Luis Felipe was also mentioning, that there is, causality goes in both ways. There is clearly a very strong, significant, positive and robust association between crime and inequality, and the relationship is even more robust and stronger than to other variables, such as poverty or education, economic activity, and employment. So there is something there. Inequality may be causing crime. This could be because under high inequality, the attractive of illegal activities may be too high relative to legal activities, and this may be particularly important for organized crime. Then also inequality may create perceptions and feelings of alienation, of unfairness, that also trigger this crime and violence. And I also like very much in the report how there is an integration of the discussion about perception and a measurement of perception in the society. And also crime may induce inequality. Crime is represents a significant cost on economic activity. It may distort investment decisions, employment decisions. It affects, of course, location. And through these channels, it also creates inequality, particularly important geographic inequality. And there is a growing literature showing also that direction from, crime being a cost on economic production in our societies. So in terms of policy, it's obviously a very difficult question. We wouldn't be talking about this if it were an easy point. But something which is important is that in terms of crime and violence, is that the distribution across the society is heterogeneous, of course. The rich suffer more crime, but for example, the poor suffer much more homicides. Of course, the poor suffer more incarceration. And when you look at the dynamics, when in a city or in a society there is an increase in crime, typically there is a higher burden of that increase falls on the poor. The poor lack the resources to hire private security. In many cases, they are afraid or they feel discriminated to approach the police or to approach the judiciary system. Something that we can think in terms of policies, whatever we can do to improve the distribution of citizen security services and judiciary services towards the poor is going to help. Not that there tend to be, because of the political process, a bias in the other direction. So the rich are more protected, and of course they have typically a smaller share of their wealth and their income at risk of crime. So some specific targeted bias in the other direction toward making the distribution of the supply of public protection more equal relative to the typical distribution of police forces and judiciary resources can help to both to reduce inequality, in this case, in the provision of a public service, and to reduce crime.
Thank you, Ernesto. We're going to go again around the table, and I am going to merge both questions in just one so that we have enough time. And I'm going to pose the same question for all of you. The question is as follows. I want to know if there is any message from our regional human development report that particularly resonates to you when you think about the region's present and future. Which is it, and why would you choose to emphasize it? And then why don't we try to talk a little bit about the topics that we as multilaterals could join forces around and work together for in the region? Bill.
Thanks again. I think I have to say that one of the freshest elements of the volume was precisely the paper that you did with Marcela Slava, looking at the distribution of how the distribution of firm size translates into income distribution. It kind of gives us a much tighter linkage from a bunch of things we understand more or less to the distribution of income, and that's very provocative. But then it leads me to another question, which is, we know that among, for instance, the successful Asian countries, there have been broad disparities in firm size distribution, and yet they all wind up being more equal than we are. So for instance, we know that Korea and Japan have these monstrous jaebol or zaibatsu, whereas Taiwan had a much more equal distribution of income, and yet their Gini coefficients are like around 0.3. So one thing that is suggested there, that there's an interaction between the firm size variables that you're looking at and external competition, in the sense that all of these zaibatsus and jaebols had to compete abroad, and in some sense they had to be competitive within. So there weren't massive rents of the kind that were documented by De Locker and Ikut, which I think you referred to earlier. So I think that's a very interesting line to follow up on, because again, it goes to income distribution, but also the whole firm size issue is both determinant, but also a result of productivity issues. So that's cool. On things that it would be great, I think it was Santiago Levy at one point said, we really need to speak more as one. There's a cacophony of advice going on in the region, and in terms of priorities, but also policy recommendations. And I think stressing again the human capital agenda is something that you just can't let sit for another 2 decades. I disappeared from LAC for a decade, and then I came back, and the pieces are still as lousy as they were when I left. So I think that getting that message and getting some ways of approaching the issue that don't constantly pit us against teachers' unions, but can actually yield some results on the ground, could be something that, if we spoke with a coherent voice, would be very useful.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you for your comment on these ideas that we're trying to draft out of this paper that for us is a very, very first draft, but I'm glad that it helps open up a conversation that I think it's necessary in the region. Eric, want to go on?
Yes, Marcela. And first of all, congratulations for the report. And I think we share a lot in terms of the assessments and the conclusions. I really like the report that you produced. So if I have to choose a couple of topics, I would say one topic that you tackle in the report is the issue of perceptions in inequality. I think that's an important point, and in a forthcoming report on trust, we also try to understand what is the impact of perceptions on trust. And we find, as you do, that perceptions many times differ substantially from actual inequality. And that's why sometimes we are surprised that when we see some popular uprising in places like Chile, Colombia, or Ecuador, where objective indicators are showing improvements, as you show, poverty rates and income distribution and so on. Probably we have a blip here into 2020, but in general, we have enjoy a good trend. But people don't check the income or wealth distribution using census data. So they infer their place in the distribution or how just the distribution is by comparing themselves with the people they know. So in most cases, they base their estimates on the quality of the services they receive in their neighborhoods. Therefore, we shouldn't not only reduce objective inequality, but we also need to improve people's lives directly with better public policy. And probably economists, we did a lousy job in explaining what are the benefits of growth and the impact on poverty and income distribution too. The other topic that I would like to highlight in your report is crime. Ernesto already mentioned some issues related to that. And I have to say that high inequality reduces trust, and lower trust reduces the demand for public policy to combat crime. So for example, we find that when trust is low, individuals are less likely to accept higher taxes to finance the police. Instead, they prefer to spend the money on protecting themselves, which is inefficient. And moreover, when trust is low, individuals don't like the idea of hotspot policing, which we know is more effective at reducing crime, but people prefer policy officers to be distributed equally across the whole territory. So there are some really nice ideas regarding this discussion that we can try to move from the assessment to the policy action. And I think, let's hope that this evidence will lead to action.
And on things we could do together as multilaterals. I won't let you
No.
get away without saying it.
Yeah, no, so many things, because we completely agree, I think, in the assessment that we need to increase growth and reduce inequality. So we're coming from the slogan of inclusive and sustainable growth, but now we have to do it. And we have to break the inertia in terms of how to put together a plan, a long-term plan, because I think the assessments are similar, but now we have to try to think long-term, try to avoid the political cycles, try not to use like political competition in terms of doing the reform of the reform every 4 or 5 years in our regions, in our countries. And that's why we would like to propose long-term institutions that tackle structural issues in terms of infrastructure, health, education, because it's very common in our countries that we are making the reform of the reform, and this is very, very negative for the livelihoods of our people. So I think we have a very complete agenda, so we can join forces with the UNDP, with the World Bank and the IDB to put together not only the right assessment, but also a policy strategy.
Thank you, Eric. Ernesto.
Well, as I said, I like the overall vision, the ambition and the multidisciplinary framework of the report. Regarding specifically, I mean, one message that resonates with my current concerns, I share with Eric a concern about this people's frustration in Latin America with unfairness and inequality, and how this frustration, accentuated likely by the pandemic, can influence people's political attitudes and preferences for certain policies. It's difficult. I mean, it's an old problem how to manage this, the trade-off between equality and efficiency, and an old problem for us and economists. But in particular, the one challenge is avoiding some extreme redistributive policies that could damage growth. And an example, like Eric mentioned, is Chile today. I mean, you look at the media or the social networks, and people talk about the failure of Chile, and there seems to be a strong political discontent with the economic model. But when you look at the data, the results, the long-term results, for example, since democracy, are really spectacular in terms of growth of GDP per capita, in terms of reduction in poverty, and also, like you show in one of the tables in your report, in terms of reduction in inequality. It is also true, as you show in the report, that Chile, in terms of level, still has like the largest share of income by the people in the top 1% of the distribution, or the top 10% of the distribution. And for example, you also show that it is one of the countries with the highest concern about the country being governed by the interests of the powerful groups. But my concern, I live in Argentina, is that some redistributive policies, of course, it depends on the design, and can also affect growth. In the report, for example, shows that Argentina is the country with the highest level of redistribution through the fiscal system of Latin America, when comparing Gini indices before and after taxes. But we have not grown for the last at least 10 years, and we have the GDP per capita of some decades ago. And let me give you a specific example. Individual wealth stocks in Argentina are heavily taxed, and during the pandemic, there was an additional wealth tax imposed. And as a response, many rich people have migrated, at least fiscally, to other countries, which also highlights, going to your second question, an issue of coordination, an issue of, I mean, what happens if some countries implement some taxation policies and other don't. So going back to the example of Chile and Colombia, Ecuador, Peru could be other examples. We face the risk that the discontent with these high levels of inequality, albeit falling, that you highlight in your report, can jeopardize some successful processes of economic growth. So something, I mean, of course, again, we do not have a solution here, but I feel we need to transmit to our societies a message of patience, that development takes time, that and it is I mean a difficult path. That is something that, perhaps going to your second question, I mean, multilaterals can do together. And perhaps, I mean, more broadly, the traditional role for multilaterals like the IMF or the World Bank, the IDB, and CAF has been to provide funding, to provide credit. And now capital is relatively abundant. And in many cases, in many countries, I mean, interest rates are quite low, even negative in real terms. Some countries, like mine, are far away from investment grade, so some countries still need strong help from the multilaterals, but other countries in the regions don't. I think that in addition to the provision of credit, there is a work for all of us together in a provision of knowledge, in a provision of, in particular, knowledge applied to public policies. And also, this is not something to discuss with countries or institutions individually, because something that the pandemic highlighted is that there are strong externalities in our world. So because of these externalities, like my example about taxation, there are issues of coordination, and I think multilaterals can play a role in addressing these sometimes negative, sometimes positive externalities, and in the provision of a public good, which is knowledge.
Thank you, Ernesto. Thank God you mentioned knowledge, because otherwise UNDP is out of the game, since we don't provide credit. But we're really, like, I actually am obsessing together with Luis Felipe about picking fights and picking priorities so that we can somehow join forces, as Bill was saying. And since we have, I guess we don't have that much time, but maybe very quickly, how do you feel about universal social insurance systems and trying to push forward in that direction? Understanding that the fiscal moment is difficult and that we would need to come together with an idea of how to gradually transit towards that. But is that something that we could push together in the region, all of the multilaterals together? I guess that's a yes or a no answer. Very quickly, Ernesto.
I like the idea in two dimensions. One is that, like you discussed in your report, to provide social aid without distorting labor decisions, and also because as long as it is universal, it may reduce clientelistic motives which forces are pervasive in the region.
Bill.
So yeah, so I think that we all probably agree that the current system is not well designed for protecting workers in particular, and also leads to a bunch of distortions of the kind that Santiago has highlighted, as have others. My worry a little bit is financing. Certainly a universal system is going to decrease the incentives, actually almost definitionally, of informality in some ways, right? And that's a good thing, but I don't see us dismantling the existing system. And so then the question is how we're going to finance the system we imagine, and if that's going to be all of the EVA, are we going to start getting sort of, I mean, that's going to push rates pretty high. I don't know. So, but yes, it's worth talking about. What? Yeah, what was that?
Eric?
In theory, sounds good, but you also mentioned when you posed the question, the fiscal challenge. And as Bill pointed out, the fiscal challenge today is huge, huge. So I think we have to take into consideration when we plan a new social protection plan for our countries that we're going to spend a couple of years fixing the fiscal side. Debt levels are increasing hugely. So we have to think about this and try to think long term and try to put together a plan to impact growth as you mentioned, and this is the focus of your report, and also at the same time tackle the social issues. So I think we need to join forces, have deeper discussions on that, and have a plan together. That would be nice. You're muted.
Thank you. I did it backwards. The fiscal challenge together with people on the streets protesting taxes, I think need to come into the equation. And I was going to say, when you were closing, Bill, that we probably need to think of some sort of hybrid systems in which we start from where we are and see how to transit to universality. But that's a conversation that we really want to have, and to which I personally invite you. Luis Felipe, you're going to close. We have a few minutes.
No, I mean,
Thank you.
Just very informally, just thank you so much. So as we said, this is an attempt to open a conversation rather than to come up with all the answers. And the idea to find, these are issues that we have all been discussing for a long time. The idea is to try to find something, some additionally, additional new evidence on this, but also more important to try to find the connections, and eventually, because of the list of things we would like to do, to see where we can start, and then where we can come together as multilateral institutions to try to push in one direction, that one or two things that could change the dynamics in the way that we expect it, in a way that is feasible, you said, politically and fiscally. So it's a huge challenge, but that's why this conversation is very important. And it's very important to have this conversation with people who have worked on these issues in such a committed way from an analytical perspective. So thank you to La CEA again, and Juan Fernando, and thank you, Marcela, for leading the work with the team and for organizing this session.
Thank you, everyone. I think we're right on time. Juanfer, you're there. Thanks for a great organization.
Thank you.
La CEA.
I'm here, and I'll be sending messages to you, telling you that you can extend the session if you want, of course, without abusing the time of the guests, so that if they can stay and you want to go longer, we don't have anything after this for 40 minutes. So, of course, people may want to take a break, but you're welcome to informally keep chatting.
Marce, me toca correr. Tengo otra reunión que me toca.
Bill, gracias.
Pero gracias a ustedes.
No, a ti. A todos.
Gracias, Bill.
Yo creo que si quieren, si hay algunas preguntas o cosas que la audiencia quisiera, no sé si alguien de los participantes en la sesión quisiera decir algo, Juanfer, pudiéramos abrir el campo. Yo no sé, Luis Felipe, si tú tienes también que correr. Quiero liberar a todos, dado que no estaba esto planeado. Así, pero les agradezco muchísimo. Para nosotros importantísimo poder oírlos y tener esta conversación. Y siempre un gusto. Y lo único que lamento es que, como dije al comienzo, no tengamos una sesión de un trago esta noche, como en una La CEA normal. Retornaremos a ella.
I always say that this is the beginning of the conversation, but it was never taken so seriously.
Voy a confesar algo público, Marce, es que yo desde hoy a mediodía he repartido entre close friends mi personal Zoom link para tragos hoy y mañana, cualquiera de los 2 días o los dos, a partir de las 6 de la tarde hora del este. Así que bienvenidos.
A mí no me lo compartiste, o sea, no somos
No, por eso lo
friends.
estoy diciendo, o sea, no te lo estoy ocultando, te lo estoy compartiendo de viva voz y en público. Y además creo que se está quedando, así que de hecho, déjenme, trato de ponerlo aquí en el chat y los espero para tragos hoy, mañana o los 2 días.
Abrazos, saludos a todos.
Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por todo. Felicitaciones.
Gracias.